What if I told you that the hardest you will ever fight?
And like the most excruciating psychological pain you will ever feel, right?
Exactly. The absolute worst anxiety you will ever experience is, well, it's entirely over a reflection in a puddle of water.
It sounds absurd when you say it like that, but it's true.
Right. I mean, think about it for a second. Think about the last time you felt just, truly devastated or blindingly angry.
The kind of angry where your heart is just pounding.
Exactly. Now, imagine realizing that the thing you were trying so desperately to protect didn't actually exist. Not in the way you thought it did, anyway.
It's a terrifying thought.
It really is. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are exploring a philosophical system that, well, it actively refuses to let you build a foundation.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't just take away the foundation. It sort of pulverizes the concrete.
Right. We're looking at a text that basically takes a sledgehammer to your most basic, fundamental assumptions about reality.
It is the absolute definition of an intellectual freefall. I mean, there's just no ground anywhere.
And for those of you joining us today who are, already deeply steeped in Madhyamaka philosophy.
You already know that this freefall is not a glitch in the system.
Right. It is the entire point of the system.
Yeah, we aren't here to give you a new comfort blanket today. We are here to analyze the precise, almost surgical methodology of dismantling the one you already have.
Exactly. We are specifically tailoring today's journey for those of you who want to plunge way past the introductory concepts. We want to get into the intricate, really structural mechanics of Madhyamaka.
Which is honestly where the magic happens.
For sure. So our source material today is a brilliantly crafted poem titled The Unsupported Mind, or Anālamba in Sanskrit.
And we should clarify, this isn't just, pretty spiritual poetry. It's a rigorous sequential operating manual.
Yes, it is explicitly inspired by Nāgārjuna's Yuktiṣaṣṭikā, the 60 verses of arguments.
Right, which is one of the most foundational texts in this entire tradition.
Exactly. And the core mission of this deep dive is to map out exactly how this poem's arguments progress, like step by step.
Because it really does corner the mind, doesn't it?
It does. It corners you until you have absolutely nowhere left to hide. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it. Because Nāgārjuna's genius in the Yuktiṣaṣṭikā was recognizing that, well, humans have this incurable disease of reification.
Meaning we inherently treat concepts and objects.
And our own selves, yeah.
Right. We treat them as if they possess a solid, independent core.
Exactly. And this poem takes that exact diagnostic framework and translates it into a psychological progression.
So it doesn't just, tell you that things are empty.
No, it forces you to experience the collapse of the very scaffolding you use to understand the word emptiness itself.
Which is wild. Because before we can start dismantling reality, we have to look at how the poem maps the very space we occupy.
Right, the opening stanza.
Yeah. So the opening lines bow to the, quote, Lord of sages, the Munindra's grace, who mapped the co-arisen boundless space.
It immediately sets the rules of this universe.
It really does. It states that no spark of beginning ever struck the night, and no final ceasing snuffs the fading light.
And then it delivers this incredible, just stunning image.
Oh, I love this part. Quote, for junctions are but drawings of a dreaming hand, cast upon the schisting empty sand.
We need to pause right there, I think, because we really have to look at the phrase co-arisen boundless space.
Yeah, because in Madhyamaka discourse, co-arisen, pratītyasamutpāda, or dependent origination, it's often misunderstood, isn't it?
Oh, entirely. The traditional elementary understanding is simply, well, temporal causality.
Like A happens, therefore B happens.
Exactly. The acorn causes the oak tree. The rain causes the puddle.
But for experts in this philosophy, we know that's only the surface level.
Right. It's just the tip of the iceberg. The poem is actually pointing to ontological interdependence.
So it's not just that things cause each other over time.
No, it's that things only exist by virtue of their relationship to other things right now.
The web is completely centerless.
Exactly. There is no center, no independent starting point.
Right. And, if I read this through a modern lens, I immediately think of, quantum entanglement or even complex systems theory.
Oh, that's an interesting parallel, yeah.
Because you can't isolate a single particle and define its properties without referencing the entire system it interacts with.
No,
right?
so true.
So when the poem says there is no spark of beginning and no final ceasing, is it basically making a physics argument? Like, that energy just changes form and nothing ever truly starts or stops.
Well, that is a really tempting parallel, but we actually have to push it further.
Okay, how so?
Because the quantum physics analogy still assumes that there is some fundamental stuff, like, energy or quantum fields, that is inherently real and just shifting it the shape.
Ah, right. It assumes a base layer of reality.
Exactly. And Madhyamaka rejects even the underlying stuff.
Wow, okay, so it goes all the way down.
It really does. When the poem invokes the negations of non-arising and non-ceasing, it's attacking the very concept of svabhāva.
Meaning inherent existence.
Right, because if a thing had its own independent, self-contained essence, it could never be influenced by outside causes to come into being.
Oh, I see. Because it would just exist independently of everything else.
Exactly, and it could never be destroyed either. Therefore, because we see things changing every single day, we know they never truly began in an ultimate sense.
So the oak tree didn't, begin from the acorn.
I know. The acorn, the soil, the rain, and the sunlight temporarily converged.
Wow. So the idea of an origin point is really just a cognitive convenience.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, it's just how our brains organize data.
Which leads perfectly into that next line. Junctions are but drawings of a dreaming hand cast upon the shifting empty sands.
It's such a beautiful metaphor.
It is. Think about how humans look up at the night sky. We see this, chaotic scattering of plasma spheres, and what do?
We immediately look for patterns.
Right. We draw lines between. We say, oh, that's a hunter, and over there, that's a bear. We create constellations.
But the constellations aren't actually there.
Exactly. The stars are physically there, sure, but the lines, the junctions and boundaries that make the hunter a distinct entity from the bear, those are entirely drawn by our dreaming minds.
And this is where the philosophy gets incredibly sharp. Because we are the dreaming hand.
Right.
But notice that the poem doesn't just say the lines are empty, it says the sand itself is shifting and empty.
Oh, wow. So the mind that is drawing the lines is also just a drawing.
Exactly. In some philosophical schools, like Yogacara idealism, you might argue that the external world is an illusion, but the mind perceiving it is ultimately real.
Like the projector is real, even if the movie is fake.
Right. But this poem completely rejects that. The drawing hand, the sand, and the lines are all equally devoid of intrinsic reality.
They are all co-arisen.
All of it.
But wait, if I'm the listener hearing this right now and I fully accept this premise,
Okay.
that every boundary, every identity, the sand, the hand, the stars, all of it is completely devoid of intrinsic reality. Doesn't that just plunge us straight into a terrifying, cold nihilism?
Well,
Because if nothing truly arises, and my very mind is just a phantom drawing lines in empty space, why should I care about anything? Doesn't the world become completely meaningless?
this raises an important question, and it is the exact psychological crisis that the architecture of this poem anticipates.
It really is a crisis, honestly.
It's the existential terror of the vacant void, or uchi-devada.
Right.
And this is precisely why the sequence of the poem's arguments is, quite literally, a matter of philosophical life and death.
Because you can't just drop the bomb of ultimate emptiness and walk away.
No, you absolutely cannot, which is unfortunately what many casual students of Buddhism try to do.
Exactly, because if you do, you end up paralyzed. You think nothing matters.
Right. And the text actively anticipates your fear here. It commands us to address the extremes of thought in a highly specific, non-negotiable order.
Yes, the second stanza. It explicitly instructs us to first cast aside the shadow of the vacant void.
Right, the nihilism.
Right. Warning us that we must do this, quote, lest ethics crumble and the path be quite destroyed.
That's such a crucial line.
It really is. It demands, quote, reject non-being first, the root of darkest faults, before the castle of inherent being halts.
The sequence here is really the hallmark of the pratītyasamutpāda methodology. The poem identifies two giant cognitive errors.
Nihilism and eternalism.
Exactly. Nihilism, which it calls non-being, or the vacant void, and eternalism, which is the castle of inherent being.
And for anyone analyzing Madhyamaka, there is this constant pulling temptation to go straight for the throat of eternalism.
Oh, for sure. We want to smash the ego. We want to smash the concept of the solid self and just, revel in the ultimate truth of emptiness.
Right, it feels very liberating.
It does, but the poet says, stop, reject non-being first.
So why is nihilism considered the root of darkest faults? I mean, if both are illusions, why is one worse than the other?
Well, because believing in inherent existence, eternalism makes you suffer.
Right.
You cling to your money, your relationships, your status, and when they inevitably change, because everything changes, you experience pain.
It is a cognitive error that binds you to the cycle of samsara.
Exactly. But nihilism is far, far more destructive.
How so?
Because if you believe nothing exists at all, that conventional reality is just this worthless, meaningless mirage, you destroy the very mechanism of liberation.
Oh, because why bother doing anything?
Right. If actions have no consequences, why practice compassion? Why adhere to ethics? Why even study this very philosophy?
You're just totally checking out.
Yeah. Nihilism essentially burns down the laboratory before you've even had a chance to discover the cure for the disease.
That makes perfect sense. It's like a surgeon washing their hands.
Yeah.
You have to establish a sterile field, which would be conventional ethics and the validity of cause and effect, before you pick up the scalpel of emptiness.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, because if you don't secure that conventional foothold, you basically just bleed out on the table while trying to cut up the tumor of inherent being.
That is a phenomenal way to put it, honestly. You absolutely must secure your conventional grounding.
Right.
But once you have rejected the vacant void, you are still left staring at that tumor. You still have to deal with the castle of inherent being.
And a castle is such a deliberate metaphor there.
It is, because we don't just passively believe in our inherent selves.
We actively fortify them, don't we?
Oh, constantly. We build these huge moats of defensiveness, walls of intellectual justification, and towers of pride.
All to protect a phantom king that isn't actually sitting in the throne room.
Exactly. There's no one in the castle.
So, once we've established that the world isn't meaningless, but we've also realized our fortified castle is a total delusion, where does that actually leave reality?
That is the big question.
Right. And the text defines the aftermath of dismantling these two giants like this. Quote, "For things are there, yet not there, in the dance of time, a relative movement, silent and sublime."
Such beautiful phrasing.
It is, but as someone trying to map the logic here, I really struggle with this phrasing.
Okay, tell me why.
Well, how can something move if it is fundamentally not there? I mean, what is actually dancing in this dance of time?
Right, okay. So you are bumping up against the absolute core of the two truths doctrine, satyadvaya.
The ultimate and the conventional.
Exactly. The conventional truth and the ultimate truth are not two different realities layered on top of each other.
No, aren't.
No, they are two ways of knowing the exact same phenomenon. So when the poet says, things are there, that is the conventional truth.
Right, like if I drop a hammer on my foot.
If you drop a hammer on your foot will break, pain is there, the hospital is there, the bill for the hospital is there.
For sure. Very real in that moment.
Yeah. But when the poet says, yet not there, that is the ultimate truth. Because the hammer, the foot, and the pain have no independent, permanent essence.
So they only exist as a relative movement.
Yes.
So the movement itself is the reality. It's not like there's a solid thing moving through space. The thing actually is the movement.
Precisely. And this is a huge distinction. Unlike some classical Hindu philosophies that posit a permanent underlying Brahman,
Right, a solid base layer.
or even early Buddhist Sarvastivadin schools that posited indivisible, momentary dharmas as the fundamental building blocks.
Madhyamaka says no to all of that.
Madhyamaka says there is absolutely no underlying substratum at all. None.
Wow.
Things function seamlessly on a conventional level precisely because they lack a solid core on an ultimate level.
Because if they were solid, they couldn't interact.
Exactly. If a seed had permanent inherent existence, it could never sprout. It would just be a seed forever.
So its emptiness of inherent being is the exact mechanism that allows it to become a tree.
Yes. The dance of time is possible only because the dancers are not frozen in concrete.
Okay, conceptually I track with that. I really do. But abstract philosophy starts to give the brain fatigue after a while.
Oh, absolutely. It's exhausting to think about for too long.
Right. You can only talk about relative movement and co-arisen space for so long before you just need something you can visualize.
And the text brilliantly pivots here, doesn't it?
It does. To show us how things can be there yet not there, it completely abandons the abstract terminology.
And drops us into incredibly visceral metaphors.
Yes. We get the image of a plantain tree and then this haunting image of a freezing lake.
The pedagogical brilliance of the Madhyamaka tradition is its use of analogy. It uses these images to bypass the intellect's defense mechanisms.
Because the intellect can argue with the two truths doctrine all day.
But it cannot argue with a peeling tree.
Exactly. So the text reads, quote, "Like a plantain tree whose layers we peel in vain, No solid core of heartwood shall we ever gain, and who would plunge into a freezing bitter lake to fight a stranger for the moon's reflective wake.
So vivid.
It is. And then it sums up the world as a mirage, a fleeting phantom show, a shimmering echo of what we think we know.
So let's unpack the plantain tree or the kadali tree in classical Indian literature.
Okay.
It is the ultimate biological metaphor for emptiness.
Because of how it grows.
Right. If you take an oak tree and cut it down, you find a dense, solid core of heartwood. It has a center.
Right, a very obvious core.
But a plantain tree is essentially just overlapping sheaths of leaves. That's all it is.
So there's no actual wood in the middle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you are looking for the true tree, the inherent essence of it, you might take a knife and peel off the outer layer. Not there.
You peel the next layer.
Still not there. You keep peeling, hoping to finally uncover the solid essence of the plantain, and eventually you have nothing left in your hands.
The tree was nothing more than the temporary arrangement of its layers.
Yes, it was never a solid entity.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, because this ancient biological metaphor maps perfectly onto our hyper-modern structures.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
Think about trying to find the heartwood of a massive modern corporation, or even an AI.
Okay, yeah.
Let's say you want to point to the actual inherent entity that is the company. You walk into the corporate headquarters.
But is the building the company?
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, they just lease the building. The building can burn down and the company still exists.
Right.
So you look at the CEO. Is she the company?
No, because she could be fired tomorrow and the company continues.
Right. So then you peel back the thousands of employees, the offshore bank accounts, the server farms, the legal documents, the branding logo on the letterhead.
You strip away every single layer of that corporation.
And you suddenly realize there is no singular thing that is the entity itself.
Yeah.
It's entirely a shimmering echo of overlapping legal and social agreements.
It's just sheaths of leaves.
Exactly. But, and here is the crucial part, tying back to the two truths, that completely empty, non-inherent corporation can still ruin the global economy.
Or lay off 10,000 people in a single day.
Right. It has profound conventional reality, even though it has zero ultimate reality.
That is a phenomenal modernization of the analogy. Really. But as an expert in this tradition, I have to challenge that analogy just slightly, just to push us a bit deeper.
Oh, please do.
Because the corporation analogy works beautifully for what we call gross emptiness.
Gross emptiness. Meaning what?
Meaning the idea that a whole is just a collection of its parts. A car is just an engine, wheels, and a chassis.
Right. That makes intuitive sense.
But Madhyamaka goes much further into subtle emptiness. It's not just that the corporation is reducible to its servers and employees.
Huh?
It's that the servers and the employees themselves are conceptually imputed.
Wait, really? The physical servers?
Yes. Even the atoms making up the server. The mind is constantly assembling fragments of sensory data into unified wholes.
So the turtle's all the way down.
Exactly. There is no base layer of reality where things finally become solid. The servers are plantain trees. The atoms are plantain trees. The mind perceiving them is a plantain tree.
Wow. And realizing that there's no heartwood to yourself or to your reality can feel, honestly, incredibly disorienting.
It can feel like you've lost something profound, like you're standing on nothing.
Which is exactly why the poet instantly introduces the freezing lake metaphor right after.
Right. They want to show you that this realization isn't a loss. It's actually a profound rescue mission.
So let's look at that line again. And who would plunge into a freezing, bitter lake to fight a stranger for the moon's reflective wake?
We have to look at the mechanics of human suffering here, or cliches are mental afflictions.
Things like anger, greed, jealousy, pride.
Exactly. How do they actually operate in our daily lives?
Give me an example.
Okay, let's say you are a highly respected academic and a younger scholar publishes a paper that just brutally criticizes your life's work.
Oh, that would hurt. Physiologically, my heart rate would spike.
Right. Cortisol floods your system. You experience genuine visceral pain and rage.
You plunge into the freezing lake.
Exactly. You plunge in, and you might spend the next 5 years of your life writing vindictive rebuttals, trying to destroy this younger scholar's career, and just losing sleep every single night.
The pain of the cold water is absolute and undeniable.
Yes. The suffering is conventionally very real. But what are you actually fighting over?
Right. What is the fight actually about?
You are fighting over your reputation, your legacy, your status. You are fighting to protect a conceptual phantom that has no more inherent solidity than the reflection of the moon on the water.
Oh, wow.
You are freezing to death, destroying your own peace of mind to hoard a reflection.
Because your reputation is just a constellation drawn in the sand by other people's minds.
Yes. The pain of the water is real, the exhaustion of the fight is real, but the object of the fight is a total mirage.
We literally freeze to death trying to punch the water to protect the moon.
It's tragic, really.
When you frame it like that, human behavior looks like absolute insanity. I mean, we ruin our marriages, we start geopolitical wars, we burn down our own nervous systems, trying to possess or destroy things that are just phantoms.
And that is the tragedy of samsara. We suffer genuinely for things that do not genuinely exist.
But the moment you realize it's a reflection,
The instinct to fight over it just evaporates.
because you can't punch a reflection.
Exactly. You don't have to convince yourself not to be angry. The anger just naturally loses its target.
Okay, so logically, if I'm in this freezing lake fighting a stranger over a moonbeam, and I suddenly have this epiphany that it's all a phantom show,
Right.
my immediate instinct is, get me out of the lake.
Of course.
I want to dry off, leave the mirage behind, and go find a warm house with a real fire. Because if the world is a mirage, I want to escape it and find the absolute truth.
That is the natural human reflex.
But the text radically subverts this expectation. I mean, it brings us to the most counterintuitive, profound pivot in the entire philosophical system.
It is the ultimate rug pull.
It really is.
Just when you think you understand the goal of the spiritual path, Madhyamaka collapses the path itself.
Because the poet explicitly redefines liberation here in the fourth stanza. This section is titled, Nirvaya is Sasara Seen.
Yes.
It tells us exactly what Nirvaya is not. Quote, Nirvaya is no distant, isolated shore, no quiet nothingness behind a locked door.
Instead, it is defined as the thorough knowledge of this very wheel.
The deep awakening to what is conventional and real.
Right. And the ultimate goal is, quote, to ride the rising wave without a grip or claw within the centerless cycle of the ancient law.
I mean, that is just a direct poetic translation of Nāgārjuna's most famous, most explosive assertion in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, right?
Chapter 25, yes.
Where he says, there is not the slightest difference between Sasara and Nirvos.
The limit of nirva is the limit of samsara.
Which, for anyone raised with Western dualistic religious frameworks, is almost incomprehensible.
It totally breaks our paradigm.
We are culturally hardwired to view liberation as an escape pod. Earth is the burning building, and heaven, or enlightenment, is the safe green field outside.
We think we have to obliterate our conventional reality to reach the ultimate reality.
But the text says it's the thorough knowledge of this very wheel. So it's an epistemic shift.
Yes.
It is a change in how you know, not where you are.
Exactly. The wheel of samsara, when viewed through the lens of ignorance and inherent existence, is a torture device.
Right.
But that exact same wheel, when fully understood as empty, co-arisen space, is nirvacha.
Okay, so let me try to interpret this as a listener and tell me if I'm pushing back too hard here.
Go for it.
Is liberation just a cognitive reframe?
Yeah.
Like, I'm still in the freezing lake, but I just put on a different pair of glasses and say, oh, well, the water is empty of inherent existence, so I'm fine.
No.
Because if I still have to pay taxes and my back still hurts and people are still screaming at me on the internet, what is the point of just changing my perspective?
I'm so glad you asked that, because that is exactly the trap of a superficial understanding.
Okay.
It is not a cognitive reframe, because a reframe implies that there is an inherent solid you who is merely adopting a new viewpoint about an external solid world.
Oh, I see. A reframe still keeps the dualism intact.
Exactly. Madhyamaka is demanding the collapse of the observer-observed duality entirely.
Wow.
When the text says awakening to what is conventional and real, it means you no longer superimpose the hallucination of permanence onto the phenomena.
So you don't just change your opinion about the wave.
No, the fundamental nature of your interaction with the wave transforms on a molecular level.
Which brings us to that incredible line, to ride the rising wave without a grip or claw.
Yes. The external wave, the taxes, the back pain, the fluctuating economy, the political instability is the exact same wave.
Right.
A Buddha experiences the exact same sensory input as you do.
Really, a Buddhist still feels the cold water.
Absolutely. But your internal relationship to it is revolutionized. The grip or claw represents upadana, or clinging.
Clinging.
Right. When a wave rises in our daily lives, we usually do one of two things. We desperately try to cling to it and freeze it in place if it's a wave of pleasure.
Like trying to make a good vacation last forever.
Exactly. Or we violently claw at it and push it away if it's a wave of pain.
We claw at the water, which is literally impossible.
It's completely futile.
You cannot grab a handful of the ocean and keep it. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it drains through your fingers.
And that squeezing is the suffering.
The squeezing is the suffering.
Yes. The suffering is not the wave itself. The suffering is the psychic friction generated by trying to grip an ungrippable reality.
Oh, wow. That makes so much sense.
When you see that the wave is just a temporary co-arisen manifestation, you stop clawing at it. You just ride it.
You experience the rise and the fall with absolute terrifying intimacy.
Terrifying intimacy, yes. But without the panic of trying to control it. You feel the pain of the backache, but you don't add the secondary layer of psychological torment.
Like, why me? This shouldn't be happening. This is ruining my life.
Exactly. You drop the narrative.
Okay, this sounds beautiful in poetry, but let's try to bring this down to the pavement for a second.
Let's do it.
How does one actually practically live in this world without a grip or claw? I mean, if I am sitting in a boardroom and a colleague is aggressively taking credit for my work.
Right. A real-world scenario.
Or I'm at a family dinner and someone brings up a hyper-polarizing political topic. How do I drop the claw in that moment?
Well, the text actually provides a psychological blueprint for this exact moment.
Stanza 5. Right?
Yes. It explores the mechanics of what it calls the unsupported mind.
And this is where the philosophy becomes almost like a martial art.
It really does.
The section is titled The Majesty of No Standpoint. It states, quote, "The great souls harbor neither thesis nor debate. For how can anger strike an unsupported state?
Keep going. The next lines are vital.
With no dogmatic ground on which to take a stand, the twisting snakes of glaciers find no biting hand. No ultimate view is held to block the open sky, as phantoms dance and conventional truths pass by."
Okay, we need to dissect the idea of having neither thesis nor debate, because this is really the defining characteristic of the prasubhika madhyamaka approach.
Having no thesis.
Right. The philosopher Candra Kurdi famously stated that he has no thesis of his own to defend.
Now, logically, stating, "I have no thesis," sounds exactly like a thesis. It sounds like a performative contradiction.
It does, yes, it's
Yeah.
a paradox. But what the text means is that the practitioner refuses to plant a flag in the ground and claim, this is the ultimate, absolute, independent nature of reality.
Even if that flag is the concept of emptiness itself.
Exactly. Because the moment you conceptualize the ultimate truth and claim ownership of it, you have turned emptiness into a thing.
You have created an inherent entity out of emptiness.
You have.
And the moment you have an inherent entity, you have territory.
Yeah.
And the moment you have territory...
You have to defend it against invaders.
Right. Look at the metaphor of the twisting snakes of cliches. It's so vivid. Afflictions like anger, defensiveness, and pride are likened to venomous snakes.
But a snake cannot inject venom into empty space.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It requires resistance. It requires a solid object, a biting hand, to sink its fangs into.
So the biting hand is our dogmatic ground.
Yeah.
It's our rigid sense of identity.
Exactly.
So going back to the boardroom example,
Mhm.
if a colleague steals my credit, why does the snake of anger strike me?
It strikes me because I have offered it a very solid hand.
Right. You've presented a target.
I have a rigid, reified standpoint about who I am, the respect I inherently deserve, and the career trajectory I must protect.
You have built a castle.
Yes. And because I am standing on that dogmatic ground, defending that castle, the insult lands, the snake bites.
Yes. And if you offer an unsupported state, meaning you do not reify your own ego in that exact moment, the insult simply passes through you.
The anger has nowhere to land.
Yeah. It really reminds me of the underlying philosophy of Aikido.
Oh, the martial art.
Yeah. The entire premise of Aikido is that you cannot be pushed over if you offer no solid mass or rigid stance to push against.
Right.
When an attacker lunges at you, you don't brace yourself and build a rigid wall to block them, because force against force just creates destruction.
You just give them nothing to hit.
Exactly. You blend with their momentum, you step into the empty space, and they basically just fall over their own violent force. If you don't stake a flag in the ground, nobody can capture it.
That is a fantastic physical metaphor, but I'm going to challenge you again to push it philosophically just a bit further.
Okay, hit me.
In Aikido, there is still a subtle duality, isn't there?
What do you mean?
There is you, and there is the attacker whose energy you are redirecting.
Ah, right. Two separate inherent entities.
Yes. But the unsupported state of madhyamaka goes much deeper than that. You aren't just artfully dodging an inherently real attacker.
Oh, I see.
You recognize that the attacker, the insult, and your own ego are all equally empty, co-arisen phantoms.
So you don't even legitimize the attack by acknowledging it as a real, solid threat in the first place.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is the specific instruction in the final couplet of that stanza. No ultimate view is held to block the open sky as phantoms dance and conventional truths pass by.
Letting the conventional truths pass by.
This is the ultimate warning against the most dangerous trap in this entire philosophy.
Which is what?
Sometimes people study madhyamaka, they intellectually grasp emptiness, and they turn emptiness itself into a weapon.
Oh, I've seen this.
They walk around saying, nothing matters, your feelings are an illusion, morality is a construct, I have no standpoint, so I can do whatever I want.
They use emptiness to block the open sky. They become philosophical bullies.
Yes. And the ancient texts call this the incurable disease.
Wow, incurable.
Yes, because if you grasp at emptiness as a solid view, you are harder to cure than someone who just believes in a solid ego. You've poisoned the medicine.
That is terrifying.
It is. But the poem explicitly tells us how to avoid this trap. You let the phantoms dance, and you let conventional truths pass by.
So you don't need to aggressively deconstruct your family member's political argument at the dinner table by shouting that their views are empty.
Exactly. You allow the conventional truth to operate smoothly.
You prioritize fluidity and peace over being right.
Yes. You prioritize skillful interaction over the neurotic need to constantly prove your ultimate philosophical view. You hold no ultimate view that blocks the natural flow of life.
You let the phantoms dance without needing to yell at them that they are phantoms.
Because yelling at a phantom is just another way of treating it as real.
Right. If you are screaming at a mirage, you are fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of water.
Precisely.
But, this brings up a massive, glaring vulnerability in the philosophy, and it's one that the final stanza has to resolve.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I am cultivating this unsupported state, if I have no standpoint, and I'm just letting the phantoms dance by, that sounds perilously close to cold, apathetic detachment.
It really does sound like that, doesn't it?
If the world is a phantom show, and my neighbor's house catches on fire, why should I grab a bucket of water? If I have no thesis, why should I advocate for the oppressed?
Right.
If we stop here, madhyamaka sounds like a recipe for highly sophisticated indifference.
And that is the exact critique that rival philosophical schools leveled against madhyamaka for centuries.
Really? They call them out on this?
Oh, constantly. They accused it of being a paralyzing philosophy that destroys compassionate action.
Which is why the culmination of this poem is not about sitting silently in a cave.
No, it is about massive, engaged, tireless action.
The entire deep dive climax is right here in stanza 6.
Let's read it.
The section is titled The Union of the Two Goods. It reads, quote, "Let boundless love and wisdom walk as one today, the skillful means that guide us down the middle way."
Such a powerful image, walking as one.
It is. Accumulating merit in the relative sphere, while seeing through the illusions, pristine and clear. May all beings by this deep and sacred light obtain the double goods beyond the dark and bright.
Here we have the absolute synthesis of the entire Mahayana Buddhist path.
The union of wisdom and love.
Exactly. The union of prajna, which is the wisdom that realizes emptiness, and upaya, which is skillful means, driven by bodhicitta, or boundless, compassionate love.
The poem insists they must walk as one.
Because you cannot walk the middle way on a single leg.
Right. Because if you only have love without wisdom, what actually happens?
If you only have boundless love without the wisdom of emptiness, you plunge headfirst into the freezing lake.
You drown with them.
Exactly. You see the suffering of the world as inherently real, solid, and absolute. And because of that, you become utterly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of pain in the world.
You drown with a stranger in the lake because the weight of the reality crushes you.
This is exactly what we call burnout. Pactivist burnout, caregiver burnout.
And on the flip side, if you have wisdom without love,
if you only have the wisdom of emptiness without boundless love, you just sit safely on the shore watching the stranger drown in the freezing lake.
Smugly telling yourself, well, the water is empty, the stranger is empty, the suffering is a mirage, there is nothing to do.
Right. It is a profound spiritual failure. It is the freezing of the heart.
So the mastery of the middle way is found in that incredibly paradoxical mandate.
Yeah.
Accumulating merit in the relative sphere, while seeing through the illusions, pristine and clear.
Yes.
You engage completely in conventional reality. You build hospitals, you run for local office to change unjust laws, you feed the hungry, you practice extreme patience with your children.
You accumulate merit.
Right, but you do it with pristine clarity, knowing that the giver, the gift, and the receiver are all entirely empty of inherent existence.
Yes. You take the reality of the mirage seriously on a conventional level because within the mirage, the suffering feels incredibly real to those experiencing it.
You engage in the dream to wake up the dreamers.
That is beautifully said.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Because when I hear this paradox, it raises a huge practical, psychological question for me.
What's the question?
How does one actually maintain the energy to act, to accumulate merit, to help others, if they constantly see through the illusion of it all? Doesn't the illusion drain the motivation? If I know the hospital I am building, the patients I am saving, and the me that is doing the work are all temporary phantoms in a centerless web, why go through the exhausting blood, sweat, and tears effort of pouring the concrete for the hospital?
This right here is the ultimate secret of the philosophy.
Okay, tell
It's
me.
actually the exact opposite of how we usually think. Seeing the freezing lake for what it is doesn't drain your motivation. It gives you infinite, inexhaustible energy to rescue the stranger.
Wait, why? How?
Because you are no longer weighed down by your own fear of the water.
Oh, wow. Expand on that. How does ego weigh down our compassion?
Think about it. When we act out of our normal inherent self framework, our compassion is incredibly heavy.
Heavy with what?
It is laden with conditions and expectations. We help people because we want to be recognized as a good person.
Right, the savior complex.
Exactly. Or we help because we are terrified of the suffering and want to control it.
We want to fix the world so we can feel safe in it.
Yes. We help, and then we get incredibly angry when the person isn't grateful enough, or when a hospital doesn't get built fast enough, or when the political campaign fails.
Because our action is driven by a desperate need to secure our own solid identity through the outcome.
Exactly. That kind of heavy, ego-driven compassion generates massive psychic friction. It leads to bitterness and burnout very quickly.
We are clawing at the wave while trying to save someone from drowning.
We are fighting the ocean. But when you act from the unsupported mind, knowing with pristine clarity that it is all a phantom show, the heavy armor of the ego just vanishes.
You are utterly weightless.
You are. You build the hospital simply because a hospital is required in the relative sphere, not because you need the hospital to validate your inherent existence as a savior.
And if the hospital project fails?
If it fails, you don't experience an existential crisis. You just calmly look at the new co-arisen conditions and you start over.
Because your identity wasn't wrapped up in the concrete.
Precisely. The illusion doesn't drain your motivation. It frees your motivation from the exhausting friction of self-interest. You can work tirelessly because you are carrying zero psychological baggage.
The ultimate freedom isn't escaping the work. It's doing the work with zero internal resistance.
That is the middle way.
Which gives such profound depth to the final wish of the poem. May all beings, by this deep and sacred light, obtain the double goods beyond the dark and bright.
The double goods refers directly to the ultimate and conventional fruits of this path.
So the conventional fruit is the skillful, compassionate navigation of daily life accumulating merit.
Right. And the ultimate fruit is the deep realization of the empty nature of reality.
And the poet says this state is beyond the dark and bright, because it transcends our exhausting dualistic thinking entirely.
Yes. We spend our entire lives swinging like pendulums between good and bad, success and failure, existence and non-existence.
It's exhausting.
It is. This philosophy offers a way to step off the pendulum completely.
It's not about choosing the bright over the dark in some rigid, dogmatic battle. It's about operating from a space so fundamentally open and unsupported that dualities completely lose their grip on your nervous system.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what we have analyzed today is not just a piece of abstract poetry meant to be debated by scholars in a monastery.
No, it feels intensely practical.
It is a highly practical, moment-to-moment operating system for living with absolute radical lightness.
A manual for untangling the agonizing knots we tie ourselves into every single day when we mistake the reflection for the moon.
Exactly.
To bring this all the way back to the beginning, we have traced a stunning trajectory today.
We really covered a lot of ground. Or, well, empty space.
Yeah, empty space. We started by mapping a centerless universe, realizing that our most fundamental boundaries and identities are just drawn by a dreaming hand in shifting sand.
The constellations.
Right. We learn the critical surgical sequence of dodging the paralyzing trap of the vacant void, keeping our ethical footing intact before we turn to dismantle the fortified castle of our own inherent egos.
Reject non-being first.
Always. We look deeply into the plantain tree and the freezing lake, realizing that fighting for phantom stakes only generates real suffering.
We punch the water to save the moon.
And we confronted the terrifying and liberating truth that Nirvus is not an escape pod to another dimension, but the exact wheel of Samsara seen with clear eyes.
Allowing us to ride the rising wave without a desperate claw.
We learn the mechanics of the unsupported mind, dropping our dogmatic stances so the venomous snakes of anger have absolutely nothing to bite into.
No biting hand.
And finally, we brought it all to its climax, proving that the ultimate realization of emptiness doesn't lead to apathy, but to an explosion of tireless, weightless, boundless love in the real world.
It's the ultimate deconstruction, leading to the ultimate engagement.
And that leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you transition back into the flow of your day.
Oh, this is the best part.
If your mind is truly aiming for this unsupported state, and reality is indeed a co-arisen centerless web, then every single mundane interaction you are about to have isn't a distraction from the ultimate truth.
No, it's not a distraction at all.
It is the exact fabric of it.
Yeah.
The traffic jam, the difficult email, the argument with a loved one, these are not obstacles on your path to clarity. They are the wave.
Ride them without a claw.
Exactly. What happens to your daily frustrations, your simmering angers, your deep-seated anxieties when you begin to treat them as just the water reflecting the moon, rather than the moon itself?
It changes everything.
Think about that the next time you feel the overwhelming urge to plunge into a freezing lake to fight a stranger. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the profound, bottomless depths of Madhyamaka. We'll see you out there, weightless, riding the waves.